History is chock full of great men, but there's one guy who basically served as the prototype for all the rest.
He just conquered everything.
At one point, he ruled half the world, and the other half was owned by like the Persian king at the time.
And he bodied him too.
Why would one person think that he could own the whole world? One person. Why would he have that mind? Who would think like that?
He never lost a major battle. Just such a badass.
I'm talking about
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great.
Now, chances are you've heard that old idea about Alexander being to Caesar as Caesar was to Napoleon. But I think there have probably been more would-be Alexanders than would-be Caesars or would-be Napoleons combined. I literally just looked this up a moment ago, but there are 877 million search results for Alexander the Great and only 231 million for Caesar, so including Augustus and Julius, and 102 million for Napoleon. If you were to look at Caesar's great rival, Pompey Magnus, Pompey was even more obsessed with Alexander than Caesar, going so far as to copy Alexander's Hellenistic haircut. For his part, Napoleon also looked directly back to Alexander across a distance of 2 millennia. Alexander is kind of the whole reason why he invaded Egypt, if we're being completely honest. But even though Alexander has been covered endlessly in books, podcasts, and YouTube videos, in my view, a good story is always worth retelling. And there is arguably no greater story in all of human history than that of Alexander. Throughout this story, he sometimes comes across as almost superhuman, at other times all too human. He has the great fortune of inheriting a kingdom at 20 and the great misfortune of losing an empire, as well as his life, at 32. He is the poster boy man of action, tutored by the poster boy man of thought, Aristotle. He toppled the first world empire in history, and within a single lifetime extended its reach to new lands and peoples. His greatest fault, besides hubris, the fact that he was unable to stop, as Will Durant observed of Napoleon. At the time of Alexander's death, he was planning to go further still, to the Arabian heartland, and then west, back to the Mediterranean, where Rome and Carthage were just getting started. Morally, Alexander wasn't any better or worse than the empire builders of his time, but the difference lay in the scale. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, lay dead in the wake of his conquests. And at the time of his death, when he bequeathed his empire to the strongest, the whole artifice quickly collapsed. Today, I want to begin telling the story of Alexander, focusing specifically on his birth, the legends surrounding it, his upbringing, and his family. Before Alexander, there was Philip of Macedon, who might have been called the Great had it not been for his son. There were also 2 other Alexanders before the Great One, in a long line of debauched, brutal, and clever Macedonian kings. And who could forget Alexander's Epirot mother, Olympias, the snake-worshipping member of the Dionysian cult. Finally, I want all of us to get a better understanding of how Alexander managed to tame Macedon and Greece. Because even if there would have been no Alexander without Philip, his early reign was no cakewalk, and his eventual success no guarantee. In some ways, Alexander would be at his most impressive, not in faraway Asia, but much closer to home in southern Europe. So with all that said, let's jump right in. The main source for this video is Philip Freeman's modern biography, Alexander the Great. Highly recommend it. There will also be sprinklings from ancient authors like Plutarch and Arrian, and for a literary flourish or two, I'll be quoting from William Bolitho's 12 Against the Gods. A full source list can be found in the video description, as always, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for watching, commenting, subscribing. We're almost at 50,000 subscribers, which is a huge milestone, so a big thanks to everybody who helped us get there, and another big thanks to the patrons and members who are supporting the channel financially. Okay, with that said, let's jump in for real. Alexander was born early in the month of Hecatomion on the 6th, the very day the temple of Ephesian Artemis was burned down. In other words, Alexander was born on the 20th or 21st of July, 356 BC. It was said that this temple in Ephesus in Anatolia was burnt down because Artemis was occupied with Alexander's delivery. Artemis being a little bit like a mother nature deity, the goddess of the wilderness and also of childbirth. It was also said that the Magi ran through the town of Ephesus, striking their faces and shouting that doom was coming to Asia. In any case, that same day, the 25-year-old Philip received 3 messengers. The first told him that Parmenion, his most trusty general, had defeated the Illyrians in the west. The second, that his horse had won first place in the 106th Olympic Games, and the third, that his wife Olympias had given birth to a son. As Philip Freeman wrote, soon Philip issued a decree to honor the good news he valued above all others. He commanded a special coin be struck to celebrate the victory of his horse. Which brings us to Philip. So Philip came from the Argead dynasty. This was the royal line of Macedon, and it was said to be from Argos in the Peloponnese, Argos being a neighbor and rival of Sparta. Now, Macedon was not Greek, but there were various attempts by the Macedonian royal line to Hellenize, that is, to become Greek. Macedon was sort of this barbaric periphery, whereas Greece was the civilized core region, a little bit like the Achaemenids were to the Medes. By the time of Alexander, the Achaemenids were seen as civilized, over-civilized really, refined, effeminate, but it wasn't always so. The Achaemenids once had prided themselves on riding and shooting straight and telling the truth. That was a sort of Achaemenid saying. And it was they who occupied the barbaric periphery, while the Medes were the civilized core. Now, just like the Achaemenids, the Macedonians were a mountain people. There were lowland farmers among them, but mostly they lived in the mountains. They were more warlike, they had different customs, they spoke a different language than the Greeks. The royal line would take Greek names. For example, Philip would take the Greek name Philippos, but the Macedonians would pronounce it Bilippos, not being able to pronounce the P. And even though Alexander himself usually spoke Greek, there were times when he got angry and he switched to his native Macedonian, much like people today, when angry, might switch to their native tongue. So Alexander the Great's namesake, Alexander I, ruled during the turn of the 6th and 5th centuries BC. He hosts the father of history, Herodotus, at his court, and he tells him that the royal line of Macedon came from Argos, so he's the source for that claim. And he also tells Herodotus a pretty interesting story about the time when Persian emissaries visited the Macedonian court. So at this time, Alexander I's father, Amyntas, is king, and Alexander is present as prince, and he observes that the Persian emissaries are getting a little too friendly, a little touchy-feely with the Macedonian women. And being upset about this, he decides to pull a trick on them. He tells them that they have to go and freshen up for what apparently was going to be an orgy. The women leave, then shortly after, they come back, they start sitting in the Persian emissaries' laps, and before the emissaries could realize what was happening, it turns out it's a bunch of Macedonian dudes disguised as the women, and they proceed to slash all the emissaries' throats and kill them. So the kicker here is that Alexander was actually a great ally of the Achaemenid Persian kings. He would even wed his sister off to a Persian nobleman. So this is a little bit of a dubious and shady figure, but very skilled in diplomacy, very skilled in intrigue. And his son, Perdiccas II, is really no different from his father. Instead of playing the Persians against the Greeks, though, he plays the Athenians against the Spartans, frequently switching sides during the Peloponnesian Wars until he is murdered by his illegitimate son Archelaus amid, quoting from Philip Freeman now, the swirl of treachery, violence, and vicious love triangles, heterosexual and homosexual, that were part of everyday life in the Macedonian court. Archelaus wasn't all bad though. He Hellenized the Macedonian court, he brought Macedon closer to Greece, and he also invited Euripides to his court, and during Euripides' time there, he had plenty of subject matter to draw on for his play, The Strange and Lurid Tale of the Beachy. Eventually, Archelaus was murdered by his friend and lover Craterus during a hunt in 399 BC, and about 6 years later, Amyntas III, who was Alexander the Great's grandfather, emerged from a period of bloody civil strife, only to then be murdered by his cousin Ptolemy after only a year of rule. Ptolemy dies not long after that, fighting the Illyrians, and then the last surviving son of Amyntas III takes over, a guy called Philip. So just as there would have been no Augustus without Julius Caesar, no Charlemagne without Charles Martel, there would have been no Alexander without Philip. In about 1,500 years of Greek history, this is the first figure to come along and unite Greece, this region that today is considered the birthplace of Western civilization, which it might not be had it not been for the age of Hellenism that Philip and Alexander together ushered in. And his launching pad for taking over Greece was Macedon, this backwater kingdom that the barbarians to the north and the civilized Greeks to the south both wanted to carve up, making this achievement all the more remarkable. Quoting from William Bolitho now, "From such a start, in 20 or 30 years, Philip succeeded in making himself not only the king of a pacified and settled Macedonia, but the captain general of all Greece, a feat to be compared in difficulty to a young Mexican's arriving against law and custom at the presidency of the United States." A pretty interesting comparison to make from Bolitho, given that he was writing in the early 20th century. Now at 15, Philip was sent as a hostage to Thebes, where he grew up. Thebes was a very proud city, the birthplace of Oedipus, and its founding myth was that a guy called Cadmus slew a dragon, took its teeth out, planted these teeth in the ground, and instead of summoning the tooth fairy, I guess, a race of noble warriors sprouted from the teeth and then founded the city of Thebes. But passing from myth to history, Thebes was able to weather the Peloponnesian Wars and come out from this grueling slugfest between Athens and Spartans with the best army in Greece. In 371 BC, they defeated the Spartans at the Battle of Leuctra, and it was from the victors of Leuctra that Philip learned the art of war. Later, Philip would become a little bit of a foil to his son Alexander for being more into luxury, being more decadent than the disciplined and serious Alexander, but for the time being, he was every bit as hungry as his son would later be. So the Macedonians around this time basically fought like medieval knights and peasants did. Freeman makes that comparison because they had a bunch of untrained militiamen, but then they also had horsemen who were proud and didn't really act like a unit. So brings to mind the Frenchmen at Crécy and Agincourt, for example. But the Thebans, they fought another way. They fought with hoplites, citizen soldiers that had bronze helmets, breastplates, and greaves, an iron sword, an 8 to 10 foot long iron-tipped spear, as well as a heavy circular shield, or hoplon, hence the name. Now, each man carried this hoplon or shield on his left arm, leaving his right vulnerable, but he could rely on the man next to him for protection, unless he was on the end, I guess. And this was possible because there was a strong sense of camaraderie. This was a citizen army, highly drilled, highly disciplined, and highly professional. And the best of the best belonged to something called the Sacred Band, where camaraderie reached new heights because these were essentially 150 pairs, 300 in all, of male lovers that were chosen by the state and funded by the state, trained by the state, and encouraged in their affections because it actually made them fight better. They would basically be showing off to their lovers, hey, I'm so manly and brave, and apparently this made them fight better in battle. Now, the genius of Philip was to take all of these military innovations and then adapt them to the Macedonians. And it helped that he had absolute authority, so he could kind of shove these reforms through. After he became king of Macedon in 359 BC, he got right to work. That winter, he started raising troops, drilling them, forcing them to ruck over the mountains, maybe a few cold plunges since it was the winter, and then punishing anybody and everybody, no matter their social rank, for not following military protocol. One member of the elite was stripped of his rank for taking a bath, another was whipped for taking a drink of water before he was dismissed, and these things helped reinforce the idea that everybody had to do their part. It didn't matter what your social rank was. Even the king himself was first among equals. But Philip's problem fundamentally was that after his recruitment drive, when he's recruiting everybody and anybody in Macedon to his army, he couldn't equip all these people with the heavy armor and shields that the Thebans used. And so he did something that they tell you to do in Silicon Valley today, which is he turned something he didn't have into a feature. So he said, fine, my soldiers won't have heavy armor and a heavy shield, but they're going to move faster and be more mobile as a result. But what really made this work was that he allied this mobility to something called the Sarissa. This was a spear that was twice as long as the normal hoplite spear. It was 18 feet long, and it allowed the Macedonians to skewer the enemy before the enemy reached them. It was equally effective against the Greek hoplites, but also the barbarians, as it turns out, that were to the north of Macedon. So the Sarissa, this longer spear, kind of raises the question of why didn't everybody else just start using it? And I think there are three answers to that question. The first is that the Thebans, the other Greeks, they had heavier armor, heavier shields, and in order to use the two-handed Sarissa, they would have to give that stuff up. Secondly, pulling off the Sarissa formation was actually a lot of work. It involved interlocking spears. Even one spear out of place could mess the whole formation up. And Philip drilled his men relentlessly in order to make it happen. Greek city-states did not. Thirdly, this kind of ties into the second point. Philip had executive authority in Macedon, so he could rush these reforms through. In Greek city-states with their democratic assemblies, that simply was not the case. Philip also reformed the cavalry. He made sure that it actually worked with the infantry, so the whole army was a well-oiled machine, very unlike the French knights at Crécy and Agincourt, for example, or the Macedonian cavalry for that matter, before his reforms. So now they would wait for the infantry to make a hole in the enemy line and then exploit that gap and rush it, but not impetuously charge into battle right at the start. Later, Philip would expand diplomatically and militarily into Thessaly, which had the best cavalry in Greece, and this would further bolster his cavalry force, of course. Lastly, Philip would organize one of the first engineering corps in history, and this would allow him to build roads, ford rivers, make siege equipment, all the kind of stuff that the Roman legions would be very good at hundreds of years later. But Philip was doing this in the 4th century BC very, very early. And the great thing about these reforms is that they worked equally well on the civilized Greeks and the barbarians, like I've said already. And that would prove to be the case when Philip went to war against the Illyrians, who had killed his brother. This was a great risk, but like his son, Philip was a great risk taker. And he also led from the front, and he proved victorious against the Illyrians and made off with a wife. He would do this whenever he went off to war. With one wife, he had a son named Aridaeus, who was mentally handicapped, and then with another, Olympias, he had Alexander, of course. Okay, now for a little bit about Olympias. So she was part of the royal family of Epirus, which straddles today's Greece and Albania. And her match with Philip was a little bit of a match made in heaven, or Olympus, I should say, because while her family claimed descent from Achilles, the hero of Homer's Iliad, Philip's family claimed descent from Hercules, arguably the greatest of all Greek heroes, so Alexander could claim descent from both of these heroes. According to legend, on the day of her wedding, a lightning bolt struck her womb, and shortly after this, Philip dreamed that he was stamping a seal ring on her belly, and the seal ring had the image of a lion. And someone explained to him that this meant she was pregnant because empty things are not sealed. And he also explained that the image of the lion meant that she would bear him a strong lion-like son. So Philip was very pleased about this, but there was some stuff about Olympias that he didn't like, namely that she was part of this mystery cult, this orgiastic, ecstatic cult of Dionysus, exactly the kind of stuff that Euripides would write about, with snakes and orgies and ecstatic women and all that. And Olympias probably loved Euripides. She also loved snakes, and Philip caught her in bed one night with such a snake and basically stopped sleeping with her after that. Nonetheless, within a year of their marriage, Alexander was born, and Olympias remained a very doting, very attached mother, almost over-attached throughout the course of his life, prompting Alexander to say that she charged a very high rent for 9 months in her womb. Alexander's first teacher was his wet nurse, Lenice. She was the mother of Black Clitus, who would go on to save Alexander's life in battle. His second teacher was Leonidas, who made his life rather Spartan in more ways than one. He taught Alexander how to march, fight, shoot a bow, and ride a horse. And quoting from Freeman now, Leonidas's idea of breakfast was a forced march through the night, and of supper a light breakfast. He also used to rummage through Alexander's chests to make sure his mother hadn't hidden away any luxuries. Now, Leonidas was a bit of a cheapskate, and so he scolded Alexander for using too much incense in prayer, and supposedly he told Alexander that he could afford to use that much incense when he had conquered the spice markets of Asia, which of course, contrary to everybody's expectations, Alexander went on to do. And so, just as he wrote to Aristotle correcting his geography at the ends of the earth, he wrote to Leonidas and sent him a big package of incense, telling him that he could now give the gods their proper due. But if in some ways Alexander's upbringing was Spartan, in other ways it was more Athenian. He learned how to read, write, he enjoyed Homer, he played the lute, he was unusually good at playing the lute, and most famously he was tutored by Aristotle. And this tutelage only lasted a few years, but obviously it was enough to capture Alexander's imagination as well as that of posterity. But Aristotle was not Athenian. He was from Stagira, which is why he's called the Great Stagirite. But because his father, Aristotle's father, was court physician to Philip's father, Philip and Aristotle happened to know each other since they were kids. And at 17, Aristotle went to Athens to study in Plato's academy, but he was later invited by Philip to the Macedonian court to tutor Alexander. Philip Freeman writes of Aristotle as follows: "With his skinny legs, small eyes, persistent lisp, outrageous clothing, and gaudy rings, Aristotle must have made a laughable impression. But when the man spoke, Alexander knew he was in the presence of genius, and a practical genius, one might add, because as Freeman goes on, Aristotle practically invented logic and deduced that the universe must have been created by an all-powerful prime mover, who, however, took no interest in his handiwork." So Aristotle was a little bit of a deist. Aristotle was the first great experimental scientist with physics, astronomy, biology, embryology, and meteorology. He knew from observation and experimentation that the Earth was a sphere, take that, flat earthers, that whales were mammals, not fish. He pioneered the study of ethics and argued that the greatest virtues come from moderation. He declares that man is a political animal, a creature who finds his true home in the polis, or city. So Aristotle was a Renaissance man. He was really interested in anything and everything around him. And it's likely that Alexander picked up his interest in medicine from Aristotle. He would personally look after his men when they were wounded or had some sort of malady, and he took pride in finding the cure. Aristotle also left Alexander with an annotated copy of the Iliad. It's called the Iliad of the Casket because Alexander kept it in a casket or box underneath his pillow alongside a dagger. And I think that beautifully captures the essence of Alexander, the dagger on one side and the Iliad on the other, personally annotated by Aristotle. But even before Aristotle, something that was clear about Alexander is that he was unusually precocious. So at about age 7 or 8, while his father was away, he received some Persian emissaries. And these emissaries were completely disarmed by this child who was asking them about the length of Persian roads, about the great king, about how he dealt with his enemies. It's almost like the 7, 8-year-old Alexander was gathering intel about his future conquests. Also apparent from early childhood was this simmering resentment toward his father, this desire to compete with him. He almost felt like the more Philip would leave him, the less his own glory. His frequent complaint to his boyhood companions was, after hearing about one of his father's conquests, "My father is leaving me with no worlds to conquer." A line that has been quoted and misquoted endlessly, my favorite instance of which has to be in the hit movie The Big Short.
Jared, it's chaos down here. Where are we?
And Caesar wept for there were no more worlds to conquer. Shane? Shane?
There's also the story about how Alexander tamed Bucephalus at about age 10. So Bucephalus was this jet black horse, big and powerful and highly spirited. Alexander would take him from Europe to Asia to the ends of the earth. And as Plutarch tells the story, a Thessalian merchant came and tried to sell this horse to Philip and his court at about 13 talents. And they thought the horse too spirited. They thought that he couldn't be tamed until a 10-year-old Alexander remarked, "What a horse they're losing, because in their inexperience and softness, they cannot manage him." And keep in mind, Macedon is a nation of horsemen, and these are the best horsemen in the kingdom. And so Philip quickly put him in his place. He said, "Do you criticize your elders in the belief that you are more knowledgeable and better able to manage a horse?" But obviously, this 10-year-old had a massive ego because he came back with, "I would manage this one at any rate better than anyone else." And then he said that if he failed, he would pay for the horse himself, presumably with his royal allowance or something. And so Philip lets Alexander take a crack at it. Alexander walks up to the horse, and proving that he's not all brawn, but also brains, he turns the horse toward the sun, because he apparently guessed that it was afraid of its own shadow. And then as the horse was calming down, he leaps up onto it, and they ride off together into the sunset. And at first, Philip and his court are worried sick about the prince, but then Alexander and the horse come bounding back, and Philip takes his son into his arms, kisses him, and says, "Son, seek a kingdom equal to yourself, for Macedonia cannot contain you." The other thing about Alexander that set him apart from the early days was his single-mindedness. So this was someone interested in other things, but never excessively so. Plutarch writes that when he was still a boy, his self-control manifested itself in the fact that, though violent and impetuous in other respects, he was unmoved by the pleasures of the body, and partook of such things very sparingly. His ambition kept his spirit grave and magnanimous beyond his years, for he was not eager for fame of every kind or from every quarter, unlike Philip, who, like a sophist, prided himself on his eloquence, and had his Olympic victories in chariot racing engraved on his coins. Instead, when the men who attended Alexander asked if he wanted to compete in the foot race at the Olympics, he replied, "Only if I can compete with kings." Interestingly, this kind of juxtaposition with his father extended to relations with women, surrounded by sexual excesses. As you might recall about the Macedonian royal line, Alexander was unusually reserved and respectful to girls of his age, as well as to women that were older than him. Later, he would say that sex and sleep alone reminded him that he was human, but when he was in his youth, he was even more disinterested in these things. Eventually, his mother grew so concerned that she hired a Thracian prostitute, presumably to take his V card, but to no avail. And one can't help but think that the writers of Rome HBO had that very anecdote in mind in writing Addy of the Julii, specifically the part where she sends Octavian to a brothel with Titus Pullo. Because Rome HBO's Addy of the Julii has a lot more in common with Olympias than she does with the historical Addy of the Julii, who was famously pious and chaste. As Alexander grows up, we get some, not too many, but some physical descriptions of him. So he was supposed to have been rather red-faced, shorter than average, but strong and thick-necked, with a neck slightly tilted to the left. His eyes are supposed to have been penetrating, deep-set, and watery, and possibly blue or mismatched in color according to a later source. Alexander's physical appearance, according to Plutarch, was best represented in the statues of Lysippus. And in the memoirs of Aristoxenes, it is reported that a delightful fragrance breathed from his skin, and that a sweet smell wafting from his mouth and all his flesh permeated his garments. So, in a time before toothbrushes and breath mints and cologne, sweet smells were associated with the divine, possibly because they brought to mind incense, but nonetheless, this was a through line from antiquity to the Middle Ages, when the sweet-smelling corpses of saints were thought to have been touched by the divine. Now, Alexander sees action for the first time at 16. While his father is away, he defeats the Thracian tribe of the Medians near Byzantium, and this is also the occasion when he founds his first Alexandria. And this was almost without precedent. Founding a city, naming it after yourself, was very hubristic, but his father had already done it when he founded Philippi, in the vicinity of which, many, many years later, Octavian and Mark Antony would defeat the assassins of Julius Caesar. But this was the slim precedent for Alexander at 16 already founding a city in his name. At 18, Alexander sees action at the much larger and more consequential battle of Chaeronea, and he is in command of one of the two wings, fights very valiantly, is the first to attack the Theban sacred band. Basically, in this battle, Thessaly and Macedon face off against the Greek world, notably Thebes and Athens, and Philip's victory in the battle establishes his control over the Greek world, and it leads to the formation of the League of Corinth. It's during the peace talks with Thebes and Athens that Alexander got to visit Athens, the first and only occasion of him doing so, and thus began Philip's hegemony over Greece. Now, almost immediately after Philip obtains hegemony over Greece, he's already planning his invasion of Asia. Again, in many ways, despite the fact that Alexander is trying to contrast himself with his father, in many ways they're very, very alike. Philip also clearly, despite his more debauched and decadent side, which we will explore in further detail very soon, he still does have this restlessness to him. And if he had had longer to live, who knows, he might have been able to conquer the Persian Empire. Another reason why we might be calling him the Great, had events unfolded differently. In any case, the time seemed auspicious for an invasion because the Persian king Artaxerxes III had just been killed by his eunuch Grand Vizier, and so Philip sent his two most trustworthy generals, Parmenion and Attalus, across the Hellespont as a forward force. He then commissioned the Philippium at Olympia, which was this circular structure with gold and ivory statues of the Macedonian royal line. This has led to various contemporaries and historians ever since questioning whether Philip was trying to deify himself and his family. And this really would have been a bridge too far, because not even the Achaemenid Persians, with their practices of proskynesis, of people bowing down to their kings, not even these kings consider themselves gods. Even the Egyptian pharaohs were considered and were content with being considered divine intermediaries as opposed to gods themselves in that day and age. It was also at this time that Philip consulted the Oracle of Delphi and was told that the bull is ready for slaughter, the end is near, the sacrificer is present, which he took to be a good sign. But it's a little bit like what happened to the king of Lydia, Croesus, who was told that if Croesus goes to war, he will destroy a great empire, meaning his own. Philip's next move was to divorce his wife Olympias on the basis of adultery and to take another wife, this one a Macedonian. Now, there had been other wives in Philip's life, but this one was different because she was the niece of Attalus. And there were many in the Macedonian kingdom who wanted Philip to take a Macedonian wife and sire a full-blooded Macedonian heir. At their wedding banquet, Attalus famously proposes a toast asking the gods for a legitimate Macedonian heir, to which Alexander demanded to know whether Attalus considered him a bastard before flinging his cup at him. And this leads to almost a sort of brawl. Philip gets up and threatens to kill Alexander, but in his drunken state, topples over, to which Alexander has his famous rebuke. This man, gentlemen, was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, yet he is overturned merely crossing from couch to couch. At this point, Alexander and his father are obviously not on good terms, but they are reconciled when a friend of Philip's, Demaratus of Corinth, basically asked Philip how he intended to conquer Asia when he couldn't even keep his own house in order. So a little bit of Jordan Peterson type of advice. But almost immediately, Philip had cause to regret his reconciliation because there was this Persian satrap in Asia Minor who was trying to organize a marriage alliance with Philip and his mentally handicapped eldest son, to which Alexander and his friends kind of swoop in and try to steer the marriage alliance talks toward a match between the Persian satrap's daughter and Alexander instead. And this ends up angering Philip. He exiles all of Alexander's friends, and Alexander wisely backs off and shows deference to his father. But he wouldn't have to show deference for too long because disaster strikes as Philip attends a festival with various games and contests for a different marriage. So at this occasion, the writing is kind of on the wall. There are various grim omens, let's say. While Philip is garlanded with golden crowns, the Athenians place their crown on him and mention that anyone who plotted against Philip would find no solace in Athens, which was meant to show their goodwill to the hegemon, but can almost be read as a mafia-style warning. But as we will see, the Athenians probably weren't involved. Even more ominously, there was an actor, Neoptolemus, who delivered the following verse: "Your dreams soar higher than the sky, of greater fields to sow, of palaces grander than men have ever known. But death is coming, sudden, unseen, that robs us of our distant hopes." And Philip, apparently in a very gullible state of mind, thought he was talking about the great king of Persia. And in this sort of exuberant state, he told his bodyguards to follow him at a distance. It was okay, they didn't have to be so close. And one of his bodyguards suddenly brandishes a dagger of Celtic origin. I have no idea why it's of Celtic origin. This is just passingly mentioned in the sources without further elaboration. And he rushes up to Philip and stabs him in the heart. He then runs off, almost mounts his getaway horse, trips, and is killed by the pursuing Macedonians. And all of that brings us to the million drachma question: who was behind Philip of Macedon's death? So the finger has been pointed at the Athenians, at Olympias, at Alexander, or some combination of the three. But I think we should start with the assassin, the bodyguard, who was named Pausanias. So Pausanias came from a noble Macedonian lineage. He arrived at Philip's court as a good-looking adolescent and quickly became the king's lover. But the moment he became a full-grown man, Philip dropped him essentially for another adolescent who's also named Pausanias. So Pausanias number one, the scorned lover of Philip, begins spreading vile rumors about Pausanias number two, something along the lines of he was a hermaphrodite who slept around a lot. And despite Pausanias number two's relationship with Philip, this was somebody who took his manhood seriously, and so then he goes out of his way to prove his manliness in battle, fighting right alongside Philip, and ultimately he dies in battle against the Illyrians. And this would have been great for Pausanias #1 had it not been for Pausanias #2, his friendship with Attalus, one of the most important people in Macedon. And so Attalus, as you'll recall, this is the one who got into a drunken quarrel with Alexander, who was later sent across the Hellespont as part of the expeditionary force against the Persians. But for the moment, he was still in Macedon, and he invited Pausanias #1 to a banquet where he plied him with undiluted wine until he passed out. And at that point, the story gets very, very sordid, because Attalus then forces himself on Pausanias #1. He invites all of his guests to do the same, and then he takes his body and drops it off at the stables and invites the stable hands to his body. And this is the kind of thing that happens in Macedon, but obviously Pausanias #1 was infuriated, and he appealed to Philip for revenge. But Attalus, being as powerful as he was, Philip being married to his niece, his hands were kind of tied, and he told Pausanias that he wouldn't do anything to Attalus, basically. And at that point, Pausanias begins plotting his revenge. Around this time, Pausanias is also supposed to have met with a philosopher named Hermocrates, who, when asked by him how he could win fame and glory, told Pausanias that he could kill a famous man. So Pausanias decided to ally his desire for fame with his desire for revenge, and because Attalus was in Asia Minor already, he set his sights on Philip. Pausanias didn't have a death wish, though. That's why he prepared a getaway horse, and he also had 3 co-conspirators among the bodyguard who ultimately ended up betraying him. But his whole plan was to escape to Athens and hopefully be welcomed there as a hero. That's not quite how it worked out, and he dies basically losing his footing before he could get on his horse. Okay, but the question remains whether Alexander or Olympias were involved. So let's start with Olympias. She's supposed to have met with Pausanias once and even supplied his getaway horse, but actually this is just hearsay. There really is no concrete evidence against Olympias, but she did have the motive. She was always looking out for her son and by extension herself, and Alexander was actively being sidelined. Philip was going to embark on this grand expedition to Asia, and Alexander was being put in charge as regent of Macedon, which on paper might seem like a good thing, but in practice meant that he would be left out of all the glory to be won in Asia. And besides the motive, Olympias had the stomach for this kind of thing. Even if she didn't kill her husband, this was something she was capable of. She had been encouraging her brother, the king of Epirus, to declare war on Philip for a long time. And then after Philip's death, she had her replacement, the niece of Attalus. She forced her to watch her infant daughter burnt alive, after which time the niece of Attalus committed suicide. As for Alexander, he is also supposed to have met with Pausanias, but this is kind of hearsay. But according to this hearsay, Alexander didn't even throw his lot in with Pausanias. Instead, he is supposed to have quoted Euripides, telling him the giver of the bride, the groom, and the bride. And this is a reference to a story in which a spurned wife schemes against her husband, his new wife, and the new wife's father. So this can be taken as Alexander saying, yeah, go to town against Philip, Attalus, and also Attalus's niece. My 2 cents on this, though, are that this wasn't really Alexander's way. After Philip's death, he had Pausanias' corpse crucified, and then he had his father cremated in full view of the Macedonian army, with whom he mourned and wept for his father right alongside the rest of the soldiers. Now keep in mind, Alexander was only 20 years old at this time, and Macedon was no stranger to civil war. So it was by no means a foregone conclusion that he was going to be able to take over, that the army was going to follow him anywhere, let alone against the greatest empire the world had known up to that point. And so it was only through a unique combination of factors that Alexander was able to do so. First off, he appealed to one of his father's top brass, Antipater, who helped him assemble the army, and then it was through Alexander's own charisma and rhetorical ability, as well as a little tax cut, that he won the men to his side, apparently delivering a rousing speech to win their loyalty. He then set his sights on the Macedonian nobility. He brought back his exiled friends like Nearchus and Ptolemy, and then he appealed to his father's two top men, Parmenion and Attalus, who were already in Asia Minor as part of that expeditionary force sent against the Persian Empire. Now, it became pretty clear to Alexander that he would be able to win one of these men to his side and dispatch the other, and that would be the most expedient course of action, and the decision probably wasn't very difficult. He was going to appeal to Parmenion and then dispatch with Attalus, which is what he did. He reached a deal with Parmenion. Parmenion would become his second in command in the coming invasion, and then a lot of Parmenion's family would become embedded in the command structure of the Macedonian army and receive a number of promotions. And essentially, this would make Parmenion very, very powerful, to the point where people to this day talk about Parmenion kind of being a puppet master and being responsible for many of Alexander's early victories. Even if in the battles we're going to talk about for the rest of this video, Parmenion was nowhere to be seen, he was still in Asia Minor during that period of time. But if it was uncertain that Alexander was going to take control of Macedon, it was even more uncertain that he was going to be able to take control of the League of Corinth as hegemon as his father had. So right at the start of his reign, Thebes, Athens, Thessaly all take up arms against him. Thessaly had turned against the Macedonians after forming their cavalry contingent for a while, and Alexander begins with Thessaly. The Thessalians were entrenched along the pass between Mount Olympus and Mount Ossa, and Alexander sets out forced march or forced ride with 3,000 cavalry and his engineering corps, and he instructs his engineers to build a road across Mount Ossa instead of charging, which would have been suicidal. And the Thessalians wake up the next day and find themselves surrounded and surrender. And this couldn't have worked out better for Alexander, because it minimized not only his own casualties, but the enemies. And the enemies' numbers, the Thessalian cavalry, was now rejoining the Macedonians, and he would be able to use that against Thebes and Athens. But when he goes to Thebes, he basically catches them with their pants down, and they surrender right away. And when Athens hears of this, they surrender right away too. And so then Alexander proceeds to Corinth. He is reconfirmed as the hegemon of the League of Corinth. The League reaffirms its intention to mount this sort of pan-Hellenic crusade, this revenge expedition against the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And Alexander, of course, is put in charge of this expedition. The whole of the Greek world was once again under Macedonian control, except for the Spartans, who really weren't worth the trouble at this point. While in Corinth, Alexander has his famous encounter with Diogenes the Cynic. Diogenes and his followers basically lived like dogs, hence their name Cynic, the Greek for dog. They would poop and pee and do other things in public. Alexander found Diogenes in a loincloth, suntanning essentially. And for the first time in his life, he was being treated like a nobody. And he asks, eventually, after sort of an awkward silence between the two, whether there was anything he could do for Diogenes. And Diogenes says, yes, there was something he could do. He could get out of the way because he was blocking the sun. And so Alexander's companions obviously didn't like this. They had a lot to say about Diogenes, but Alexander kind of shut them all down by saying that if he were not Alexander, he would be Diogenes. You know, this is a story that has been recounted many, many times. It is a mic drop moment, but I don't think people often talk about why it's a mic drop moment, or I don't know. I haven't really heard any critical examinations of this story. I guess the conclusion I've come to is that these were both attention seekers. Diogenes and Alexander were both out to capture the public imagination, but the difference was that one had a crown and one didn't. And so without his crown, maybe Alexander wouldn't be so different from Diogenes, but who knows? In any case, there's another anecdote from around this time. Alexander goes and visits the Oracle of Delphi, as his father had done. But unfortunately, when Alexander arrives, this is outside normal business hours, so he does something a little uncharacteristic. Uncharacteristic because he's usually pretty respectful toward women in the context of that time, and he is also quite pious. But what he does is he barges into the priestess's living quarters and drags her out by the hair, and she basically gives him the answer he's looking for, that he is invincible, and he makes a donation and marches north. And why does Alexander go north? Well, that would be because of the Thracian raiders penetrating Macedonian territory. And Alexander does what Alexander does best. He goes on the offensive. He enters the region of Thrace and passes by the Greek city of Abdera, where, interestingly, Democritus, a philosopher way ahead of his time, theorizes that everything is made of atoms, basically. And this was a curious place for him to come up with such a pioneering theory, because it was a little bit like the Wild West. There was this town called Philippopolis, where Greeks, Macedonians, and Thracian crooks rubbed shoulders. This was a town that Philip founded, obviously, but the nickname for the town was Crooktown. And Alexander recruited some of these ne'er-do-wells to face off against the Triballi. This was a tribe of mountain dwellers that were dug in with carts in the mountains, ready to be sent toppling down should Alexander's men try to ascend the slopes and get up at them. This is where Alexander does something almost too clever to work, but somehow it does. He tells his men to dodge out of the way of the carts, obviously, but then he tells those of them who are trapped in between in this narrow slope to drop down and interlock their shields and allow the carts to roll over them. And they do this, and it apparently works. And all the while, the Macedonian archers are sending volley after volley. And Alexander, with the best of his men, is climbing up the slope, the left side of the slope. And eventually they reach the summit and kill all the Triballi, about 1,000 of them, enslave their women and children, and take all their loot. Conan the Barbarian type of stuff. But it was then that another group of the Triballi tried to out-barbarian the Macedonians by luring them into a dense patch of woodland near the Danube River. This is the thing about Alexander, which is that he is impetuous, he is bold, he's proactive, but he's not careless, at least not usually. And so instead of falling for this trap, he simply peppers them with arrows until the Triballi come out and then get skewered against the Sarissas and trampled by the Macedonian and Thessalian cavalry. At this time, about 3,000 Triballi died. At this point, Alexander can and probably should turn back home, but instead, Philip Freeman writes that he was seized with a longing, a pothos in Greek, to cross the river into lands no Macedonian had ever trod. Darius had led a Persian army north of the Danube. Why not Alexander, writes Freeman. So he wouldn't be the first guy to do this. Darius had done it, but he would be the first Macedonian, and he would be outdoing his father. So that very much appealed to him. And this is something else we will observe of Alexander again and again, that he is a general, he's a warrior, but he acts very often like an explorer as well. He's a little bit like an ancient conquistador. And obviously he's not going out and exploring new lands and places and not encountering new people simply out of curiosity. He doesn't always have benevolent intentions. This is not eat, pray, love type of travel. But I think it would be fair to say that he is genuinely motivated by curiosity just as much as ego and the desire to conquer. And William Bolitho is great on this segment. He describes it as a real heart of darkness expedition. He writes, "Beyond the Danube was the mystery of darkest Europe. Alexander reached it at night and waited till dawn, peering across. Somewhere, unguessably far off, at this time men were building Stonehenge, worshipping in the gaunt alleys of Karnak, perhaps still adding an inch a year to the middens of Denmark. Prehistoric Europe. Alexander hesitated. Not for the last time, the main current of the world was in that stream. Everything was possible that night. But there remained the question of how he was going to cross this big, mighty river, because he didn't have the time or the supplies to build boats or a bridge. He really didn't have any reason to mount this pointless expedition, but what he did have was a clever idea, one based off Xenophon's Anabasis, the story of Xenophon's expedition with 10,000 Greek mercenaries up and down the Persian Empire. And what they did was they took their tent covers and folded them together after filling them with straw, and then sewed the edges and used their tents as flotation devices. And so Alexander and his men got to sewing. They also requisitioned some canoes and some Macedonian ships, and then in the dead of night, 5,000 infantry and cavalry crossed the mighty Danube. This time they faced the Getae, who definitely weren't expecting them, and they quickly collapsed before the Macedonians. With this, Alexander's position in the north was more than secure. He has a peace conference with the Triballi. They agree to send a contingent back with him, and this contingent accompanies him to Asia. There's even a report of a Triballi who then settles down in Central Asia. And around this time, Alexander also meets with a delegation of Celts. So the Celts around this time were migrating from the British Isles, I guess, back to continental Europe, and by this time they had even made it as far east as the Balkans. And Alexander meets with some of them and asks them if they fear anything, and they say, no, we don't fear anything except, jokingly, the sky falling on top of our heads. And no armed confrontation takes place, but Alexander finds the Celts awfully cocky, as Aristotle warned him he would. After that, there is one remaining threat in the north that Alexander has to deal with, and that is the good old Illyrians. And it was during his confrontation with them that he and the rest of the Macedonians find themselves surrounded near Pelium. This is when Alexander does something else that probably shouldn't work, but it does. He stages essentially a military parade. He shows off the Sarissa formation, and the Illyrians are so impressed by this and so intimidated by this that they start backing off, and they give him the breathing room necessary to make a break for it. And to be clear, the Macedonians were in retreat, but it remains an organized retreat. And it was in this instance that Alexander basically becomes one of the first generals in history to use artillery in the form of catapults in a field battle. These catapults were usually used as a siege weapon, and he instead uses them to screen his retreat. So here again, he is setting himself apart based on his ingenuity, but then also in the aftermath, his refusal to shy away from battle. Instead of going back to Macedon, he knows that the threat isn't extinguished, and so he sends a scout to track the Illyrians' movements, and eventually he ambushes them at their camp and kills them and ends the Illyrian threat. Meanwhile, back in Greece, at some point during Alexander's northern campaign, word got out that he had died fighting the Triballi. And as the historian Arrian said, the Greeks quickly started believing what they most wanted to believe. And so they fooled themselves into thinking that, yes, Alexander was dead, and the time to revolt was now. So the proudest of the Greek cities, Athens and Thebes, both rose up in revolt, and their rallying cry was Eleutheria, freedom. Alexander rushed back. He didn't want the Theban sacred band combining with the Athenian cavalry and being bankrolled by the Persians and inspiring more waves of Greek resistance. He knew that such a coalition could very quickly smother any expedition against Asia in the cradle, and so he had to deal with it fast. He marched his men about 20 miles per day, which was super fast given the harsh terrain, and then he surrounded the city of Thebes. How was he able to go that fast? He owed a debt of gratitude to Daddy Philip. In addition to some of the structural reforms of the Macedonian army, Philip enacted a number of logistical reforms. So the Macedonian army had fewer camp followers than other armies at that time. No girls allowed. and each cavalryman was limited to 1 servant, and there was only 1 servant for every 10 infantry. And these attendants would also help the engineers carry their tools and supplies. Like Xenophon, who during the Anabasis describes burning the ox carts and wagons, Philip eschewed with these. He discarded the wagons and ox carts, but he replaced them with horses, making him one of the first generals in Western history to do so. And meanwhile, Philip's men were called Philip's mules because each of them was expected to carry about 80 pounds worth of supplies, including rations, blankets, tools, medical supplies, and of course their sarissas, which could be detached into 2 sections because of how long they were. And much later, Marius, the great Roman general, would enact similar reforms, earning his men the nickname the Marian Mules. So Alexander had surrounded the city of Thebes, and during the siege, a contingent of the Macedonian army breached the city, but was then chased out by overzealous defenders. Alexander quickly took advantage of that fact by taking the offensive and breaching the city, because apparently those overzealous defenders weren't able to lock the gates before his men got in. And then you get a case of Stalingrad-style street-by-street fighting, without the guns, obviously. There was killing, raping, 6,000 Thebans lay dead, the rest were sold to slavery, and the city was left in burnt ruins. It was as if the dragon from their founding myth had risen up and wrought a fiery revenge. And that was effectively it for Thebes, just like that. One of the great Greek city-states gone up in smoke. Most likely this was Alexander setting a terrible example to the rest of the Hellenistic world, but it was also an example he could get away with given that Thebes had some skeletons in the closet. So they had been collaborators to the Persians in the second invasion of Xerxes in 480. And so however brutal this act was, Alexander knew that if he was going to make an example of any city, Thebes, with its pride, but also its skeletons, would be the one to bear it. There were some instances of mercy. The priestly class was spared. The family of the Theban poet Pindar was spared, probably because Alexander was a fan of his poems. There was also the case of a woman who was raped and then managed to push her assaulter down a well somehow and then throw stones at him until he died. And after she was brought to Alexander and explained her story, she was let go along with her children. And with that, Alexander was ready to go to Asia. The other Greek city-states were spared, most notably Athens, which was still needed for its navy. The Macedonians threw a bunch of parties. Antipater was put in charge of Macedon, and Alexander made extensive sacrifices to Zeus, the father of the Olympian gods. And within 2 years, Alexander would prove so successful that he began considering himself a part of this divine family. So if you guys made it this far, I want to thank you for watching. Obviously, this video is a little bit of a free-form experiment. The reason for that is I just feel there is so much history to cover, and I haven't covered nearly enough ground with this channel. I want to put out videos weekly, and videos like this will allow me to do that. I really like writing about history, but I also like just speaking about it in a semi-scripted, kind of off-the-cuff way. And so I hope that this is enjoyable to at least some of you. I am way behind on patron and member exclusive videos, but I'm going to do my best to catch up on those by the end of August. As for this Alexander the Great series, it will be probably 3 parts. Part 4 in the Norman series. The 4th and final part is being worked on right now. The 4th part of the Burgundy series about John the Fearless is also being worked on. And with that, I want to thank you all one more time for watching. Another big thanks to those supporting the channel as members and patrons. And I will see all of you, this time for real, in the next video. And west, where Rome...